In this section, we're going to explore some of the additional civil rights movements that happened throughout the 1960s and 70s. Our essential question: what movements occurred in the 1960s and 70s, and what long-lasting impacts did they have on American society? These are the four movements that we are going to look at. So let's start with the counterculture. The counterculture refers to the years that the baby boomers were coming of age, when they were teenagers and young adults. The counterculture are also known as the hippies. That's probably what you're most familiar with. It's important to note that only about 10% of the youth in the United States were part of the counterculture. The reason that they hold such high placement in our culture is because they were so radical, and because some of the things that they advocated for had such an impact on American society. The reason why they are called the counterculture is because they supported culture that was outside of the mainstream, counter to mainstream culture. This was expressed in their style, the way that they wore their hair, the music that they listened to, and the beliefs that they held. The hippies were influenced by the beatniks of the 1950s, who also went against mainstream culture. A key part of the counterculture was a distrust of authority, which, as we've been talking about with the Vietnam War and Watergate, was influenced by the entire collapse of mistrust in the government by society. There was also a huge generation gap during the 1960s, a lack of understanding between the young and the old. The counterculture were entirely opposed to everything that their parents advocated for, and vice versa. There's always a generation gap between young and old, different values. But during the 1960s, that was exaggerated. There was a popular phrase among the counterculture: don't trust anyone over 30. Music was a big part of the counterculture, especially rock and roll, folk rock by artists such as Bob Dylan, and psychedelic rock were the main sounds of the counterculture. Protest songs were especially popular during this time, protesting the war in Vietnam, protesting the lack of rights, especially for Black Americans, but all marginalized group. And music was seen as a weapon of cultural revolution for the counterculture, the idea that they could use music to change society. The Beatles were also huge in the 1960s. They made their first appearance in America in 1964, kicking off the British invasion, which refers to the popularity of British rock groups within the United States. So here are some of the popular artists of the counterculture. We have Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, Joan Baez, Jefferson Airplane, and the Grateful Dead, all artists that were part of the folk rock or psychedelic rock movement. The counterculture was also about a sexual revolution. There was a rejection of traditional restrictions on sexual behavior among the youth. During the 1960s, 2/3 of people over the age of 30 opposed premarital sex, while majority of Americans under 30 did not. So this was one of the changing values in the United States. This free love movement also inspired a move towards utopian societies. We saw a lot of the youth, the hippies, counterculture, living together in communes where they rejected the government, society, mainstream culture, and especially capitalism. They set up their own small communities that was focused on trading and bartering and sharing resources. Another big part of the counterculture was drug use. A popular phrase for the counterculture was turn on, tune in, drop out. Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor who publicly and loudly promoted the use of drugs among the youth. He taught that drugs could free the mind, especially hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD and acid. A lot of this drug use happened in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, which was seen as the center of the counterculture. During the time that the counterculture was flourishing in Haight-Ashbury, there were also a lot of problems caused by the beliefs of the counterculture. There was high crime because of drug abuse and homelessness. Nevertheless, this is the wrong year. Pause. Just kidding, I was right. 1967 was known as the Summer of Love within San Francisco, with that 50-year anniversary being celebrated a couple of years ago. I was thinking it was this year for some reason. The Haight-Ashbury is a popular place for fans of the counterculture that you can still visit today in San Francisco. Woodstock is kind of seen as the end of the counterculture movement. Woodstock was a giant outdoor concert and festival that was advertised of 3 days of peace and music in August of 1969. You've probably heard of Woodstock before, seen the images. At Woodstock, over 400,000 people showed up for this festival with and without tickets. It was a logistical nightmare. And yeah, there are a lot of good artists there. We can see the images here. There was lots of nudity and drugs and sex. Everything about the counterculture rolled into 3 days. Counterculture also rejected traditional religious beliefs. Many members of the counterculture explored Buddhism and other Eastern religions, focused on harmony with nature as their main central beliefs. Here we can see the Beatles on one of their trips to India, where they were exploring the Buddhist faith. So the legacy of the counterculture, it did influence other protest movements. Many of the youth who supported the counterculture were also part of, the anti-war movement, the women's rights movement, civil rights movement, all of those. There was also a negative effect of the counterculture legacy. Backlash from the mainstream society led to the rise of the conservative movement. This would be seen as negative by the counterculture because it was mainstream society rejected all of the things that they advocated for. So the women's rights movement is our next topic. This is known, the movement of the 60s and 70s is known as the second wave of feminism. Just to be clear, the term feminist means that you believe in the social, political, and economic equality of women and men. Feminism has gotten a bad name in our current society because, just like every other movement, there were radical parts that took the movement to the extreme. But most people within the feminist movement work to just pass laws and protect women from discrimination. I asked, when would the first wave be? And hopefully you were thinking back to the women who fought for suffrage, beginning in the 1860s at Seneca Falls, 1850s at Seneca Falls, and ending in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So some of the problems faced by women prior to the women's rights movement, they were seen entirely as housewives and baby makers. That was their for many women, the only role that they were able to play within society. Women made up less than 6% of doctors and less than 4% of lawyers. Less than 40% of undergraduates across the United States were women, and less than 10% of doctoral degrees went to women. Most important was the economic inequality that existed. Women earned 59 cents to every man's dollar. This is due to lack of opportunities within the workforce, and then the jobs that were available to women being paid less. There were also issues of wage discrimination of women being paid less for doing the same job as men. So Betty Friedan is a leader within the women's rights movement. She wrote a novel called The Feminine Mystique, which explored the role of women in society. Basically, the synopsis of the book is that women were saddened and angered by the fact that they were the only options available to most of them was to be a housewife and to care for kids. It explores the problems with traditional roles of women and explores the idea of, is that all women are capable of doing? Being housewives, taking care of children. It helped start the movement because women who read The Feminine Mystique, who were housewives, they were like, wow, I didn't realize that I wasn't the only one that felt this way, and helped the book was a catalyst for women protesting and fighting for their rights. After Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, she also organized the National Organization for Women, called NOW, which was an organization dedicated to winning true equality for all women through changing the laws. So NOW fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. This was a proposed amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing gender equality. If you look at the photo, you can see this was the whole text of the amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The Equal Rights Amendment did pass through Congress, but it never was added to the Constitution because it couldn't get the required 3/4 approval of states. You can see the states are in purple are the states that ratified the ERA, while the states in yellow are the state legislatures that did not ratify the ERA. This amendment was originally opposed in the 1920s. The women's rights movement of the 60s brought it back on the table and attempted to get it passed. And there are still talks today about finally getting the ERA added to the Constitution. One of the main reasons why the ERA did not pass, I'm going to go back to her, was because of protests from women. Obviously, lots of men didn't see the need for the ERA, but there were also a lot of women who didn't want the ERA to pass because they thought that it would jeopardize some of women's special status in society. As far as, in divorces, women typically get full custody of children or primary custody. Obviously, women are not eligible to be drafted the way that men are. So women like Phyllis Schlafly advocated that women didn't really want true equality because they wouldn't want to lose that special status. So one of the leaders within the women's rights movement was Gloria Steinem. She was the most famous feminist leader of the 1970s. She established a feminist magazine called Miss, MS Dot, which is a reference to the choice of many women to go by strictly MS, whether they were married or not, because they didn't want their role in society determined by their marriage or lack of to a man, right? Women who are married traditionally go by MRS, while women who are not are referred to as Miss, MISS. So MS has become popularized for women who are unmarried or women who don't want to define themselves by marriage. Gloria Steinem said a couple of iconic quotes of the women's rights movement. A feminist is anyone who recognizes the equality and full humanity of women and men. And my personal favorite, a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle, right? The idea that a woman needs a man in her life to fulfill her is as ridiculous as a fish riding a bicycle, right? That should be up to a woman to determine whether she wants to be married and have kids and not have her status as a woman questioned because of that. So the legacy of the women's rights movement, legal rights and opportunities were expanded to women. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects against discrimination on the basis of sex. Title IX of the Higher Education Act, passed in 1972, banned discrimination against women in education. And Roe v. Wade, a Supreme Court case in 1973, protects women's right to legal abortions. Obviously, that is still a controversial topic in the United States, and ever since 1973, there has been a strong pro-life movement in the United States with the goal of ending the legality of abortion. And if you're paying attention to the news right now, then you are aware of some of the laws that are being passed in states to limit that access, with the goal of challenging Roe v. Wade. So let's talk about some other movements that were happening within the United States. You'll recall that during World War II, we had the Bracero program that brought Mexican laborers to the United States to help out with farming. Migrant labor in the United States has been a tradition for decades. Cesar Chavez was a Latino activist that fought for the rights of migrant farm workers. Farm laborers in the United States were the most exploited workers, often working long hours in fields with terrible conditions, with very low wages and no benefits. The United Farm Workers was a union made up of farm workers that won victories for migrant workers' rights using strikes and boycotts. The Chicano movement in the U.S. was about increasing awareness of Mexican American history and culture. One of the main demands of the Chicano movement was that educators and schools teach more about the heritage of Mexican Americans. They were focused on changing the narrative of manifest destiny in the United States as a purely positive thing, and also recognizing the impact that it had on different groups in the U.S. The Chicano movement also worked to increase their political strength, to have more Mexican Americans elected to state legislatures, to Congress, so that they would be able to influence and pass laws that prohibited racial discrimination specifically against Mexican Americans. We can see how the Chicano movement was influenced by the civil rights movement with the adoption of the phrase Chicano power. American Indians also had a movement during the 1960s. The American Indian Movement, also known as AIM, was an activist group that fought for treaty rights, legal rights, and better opportunities for Native Americans within the United States. Some of the problems that the Native American community faced was discrimination in hiring, um, high rates of poverty among Native American reservations, high unemployment, alcoholism and suicide among various American Indian groups. AIM was a pretty powerful movement that resulted in some progress being made, but unfortunately many Native American reservations still face a lot of the same problems, and there are still many American Indian activists who are fighting for the same causes. The gay liberation movement also began in the late 1960s. Some of the issues faced by the gay community, homosexuality was considered a mental illness, something that wasn't changed until 1973. Gay people were often denied jobs due to their sexual orientation, so members of the gay community remained closeted in order to avoid being fired or persecuted because of their sexual orientation. Being gay was criminalized in the United States through sodomy laws that existed in most states within the United States. And also there was a lot of societal discrimination based on sexual orientation. The Stonewall riots occurred in New York City in June of 1969. Police raids on gay bars were very common across the United States, which led to members of the gay community being unfairly incarcerated and discriminated against. So the Stonewall riot was an uprising against a police raid that happened at the Stonewall Bar on that night. This event is considered the beginning of the gay liberation movement in the United States, a movement that is also continuing to ensure there are currently still no national laws that prevent discrimination based on sexual orientation, though there was a large victory for the gay rights movement several years ago with the Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage in the United States.